welcome to our latest pensions webinar. This is all about the social housing pension scheme, the latest developments in that, and also the latest developments in defined contribution pensions. My name's Richard Solden, and I'm the head of the social housing pensions practice at LCP. We're the pensions network partner for Winmark's affordable housing network. And it's great to see some new faces and on our list today. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Philip Audaire, who is a principal in our defined contribution team, and Charlotte Stock, who is a consultant in our pensions team advising housing associations. If Charlotte could share the screen, then we will just, that's our mugshots, and then we have the agenda for today, where I'm going to run through a few of the latest pensions developments that we're seeing useful for housing associations. We're then going to move on to the meat of today's session, where we talk about the social housing pension scheme. Firstly, how clients reacted to the results of the 2020 SHPS valuation, but then moving on to actually what is unusually slightly good news, to give you an update on the SHPS funding position and what does that mean potentially for you as housing associations, and indeed for SHPS and the trustees that look after that pension scheme. So Charlotte and I will cover that part of today, and then we will hand over to Philip, who will cover the latest in defined contribution pensions. For all of you, I'm sure you use defined contribution pensions for most, if not all, of your current employees, so it's an extremely relevant area for your current employees and your HR policy. Philip will give us an update on developments in the market and a case study of some work he's been doing with a housing association that's helped to improve the pension arrangement that association is offering to its employees. So I'll move on to the current issues and a few headline points here that I think it's worth everyone being aware of. The Pension Schemes Act 2021, that was an important new piece of pensions legislation last year, and this came about following the difficulties that the BHS pension scheme and others have had in recent years, where the schemes have ended up with insufficient money to provide the pensions in full that they were planning to pay. Essentially, the Act has introduced new powers for the pensions regulator to impose contributions on employers where they feel that the employer is not doing right by its pension scheme. And indeed, they've introduced new criminal offences for directors if their organisations fall foul of the requirements. And I think what we're starting to see now is housing associations consider these new requirements and actually see them influencing their governance processes to make sure that they are not falling foul of these new requirements. And the area where this is perhaps most relevant is around refinancing and any corporate activity. It's important to consider up front whether any such activity, such actions could detrimentally affect a defined benefit pension scheme. And if it does, that potentially breaches the requirements, unless an organisation was to agree mitigation, something to compensate the pension scheme if it is adversely affected. And the area that we're seeing this sort of thing perhaps most relevantly being looked at is in the area of mergers. Over the last few years, lots of mergers within the sector, and it's certainly an area where we have been asked in many cases in the past to help one association investigate the pension liabilities of a potential merger partner in case that raises any red flags, in case there are additional liabilities and risks there that the association hasn't yet been aware of. as well as that due diligence process, we're now also looking at some of the tests that the Pension Schemes Act 2021 requires to see whether merger activity is something that could fail those tests and require some additional thought and consideration about how the pension schemes are affected. And I suppose one of the key tests is there is whether a pension scheme would actually receive less following a merger if there was in a theoretical insolvency situation. So essentially, if the pension scheme has less security that it can call on, then that's the sort of thing that certainly the pensions regulator is keen that employers think about in advance. And as I say, that's something that we're now seeing associations having an active view on. Local government pension scheme, another current relevant topic. The valuation of the local government scheme is underway. That's the exercise that will affect contributions that housing associations and other employers pay to their local government pension schemes, for those of you that are in them. In general, at this stage, we're not expecting major surprises from it, but each fund, each of the 89 funds within the local government pension scheme takes its own approach, and each employer could be differently affected. So there are circumstances where contributions could increase significantly, and that's certainly something for you to be alert to if you are a member of a local government pension scheme. Another current topic, how do you account for pensions? How will they appear in your financial statements? We're obviously very much in accounting season for associations, and that's something that's will be very relevant. There are flexibilities in the assumptions that you can use that affect the numbers that you present in your accounts, and there are certainly some organisations that have been very interested in looking at how that flexibility could feed through to their accounts and to the numbers that they present. Now, those are 4 quick topics. If anyone is interested in any of those, then there's certainly things that we can pick up outside the webinar, because we want to focus really now on the key topics of the day, one of which is the social housing pension scheme, and I will hand over to Charlotte to cover that one. I should have said before, as part of my chairman intro, and I'm sure I should have written this down to remind myself, do ask any questions as we go through. Please do type things into the chat function, and we'll try and pick things up as we go through.
Great, thanks, Richard. So yeah, I'm going to talk through the next few slides, which will give a summary of the SHPS 2020 valuation results, and also give some insight into how our clients have reacted to this. So on this slide here, you can see the results of the last 6 valuations of SHPS, with the pink bars representing the deficit. And I think this chart really highlights a couple of things. Firstly, just how much SHPS has been growing in size. So it's more than quadrupled between 2005 and 2020. It was a 1.6 billion scheme by liability in 2005, and it's now a 6.7 billion scheme. However, the sector itself hasn't grown at the same pace, and therefore it represents quite a risk to the sector. And secondly, each time there's been a new valuation, you can see the deficit's been increasing, that pink bar's been growing each time. And so even though at each valuation, deficit contributions have been agreed, and we haven't seen a reduction in the deficit come through at the next valuation. So each time deficit contributions have had to keep on increasing, and with the latest increase just coming through this month for employers. And if we just focus on the 2020 valuation results, we were expecting a deficit of around £1 billion. However, you can see here that it was just over 1.5 billion. So what does that mean in terms of the recovery plan? Oh, sorry, is there something come through in the chat, or? Oh, you're on mute, Rich.
Thank you. Classic error. Yes, a very good question from John. Is this all of SHPS or just the DB element? Yes, this is the DB element of SHPS. This is the element where there can be a deficit, and there are defined contribution assets on top of these. So this is just focusing on defined benefit.
Great, thanks. So yeah, moving on to the recovery plan that was then put in place following the 2020 valuation. Well, we then needed an extra 500 million of deficit contributions to close that additional gap between the assets and liabilities. That's quite a lot of money that's needed, and it's 50% more than what was expected to be needed at this point. So you can see the blue parts of the chart are the contributions that were agreed at prior valuations, and then the orange shading represents the additional contributions that were needed following the 2020 valuation. And this is a really significant increase in contributions, and on average employers are seeing sort of a 17% increase in their annual deficit contributions from this month. Not only that, contributions are going to be increasing at a faster rate, and the recovery plan was also extended by 18 months, so paying deficit contributions for longer. So this sort of recovery plan really hit housing associations from all angles. And then, as well as the deficit contributions increasing, there was a similar story for future service contribution rates. And here this table sets out the rates of pensionable salary for each section in sort of SHPS DB, and you can see that there are very big hikes in future service contribution rates as a result of the 2020 valuation. So joint contribution rates are increasing by around 50%. For example, the 60th final salary tranche is increasing by 14% of pensionable salary. Obviously, that is a lot more for either the employer or the employee to bear. Some housing associations already have a practice of passing on that increase to their employees, or some may sort of share it. It just sort of depends on what actions they've taken to date. These huge increases, I think, have really made employers who are still open to DB accrual consider their options around future service. And I think these increases in future service contribution rates are getting to the point where many are thinking that this might not be an affordable option for them anymore. And in a couple of slides, I'll sort of cover how our clients have responded to these increases and what actions they took after seeing these results of the valuation. So let's look at what employers can do in SHPS. So the top row on this slide here looks at the options employers have in relation to future service benefits. So the employer, you could pass the increase onto members, or you could change sort of the future benefits by sort of moving along to the cheaper accrual sort of tranches, move to the 120ths, or as the sort of final step would be to close completely to future accrual of DB benefits. However, a lot of employers, they've already taken action against some of the risks from future service, and certainly from those we advise. And for many, these are largely sort of not options anymore, and we need to be looking at what can be done for past service benefits. The second row on this slide here, those greyed out boxes, because SHPS is a multi-employer pension scheme and the trustees have a lot of power under the rules, they control the changes to the funding strategy, the investment strategy, and if the scheme wants to take on any de-risking. Sort of those options there in the middle, employers sort of don't have access to those, as they're controlled by the trustees. So yeah, those levers are sort of unavailable to employers really to take any action. But if we look at what can be done for past service benefits, which is along the bottom of this slide, you could carry out liability management exercises. So that could be providing transfer values to your members with supported financial advice, or you might carry out a trivial commutation exercise. Or looking at the other end of this row, you could pay your exit charge to SHPS if that's affordable, and then you'd have no further liability to the scheme and leaving your employees to have their benefits paid under the scheme in the future. However, this is often unaffordable for most employers, so this option isn't sort of actioned by many employers, as their exit charge are sort of many millions of pounds they can be. And then finally, another option which we've seen is becoming more popular is to transfer out of SHPS and either run your own scheme or buy out. And we've seen a number of employers do this to run their own scheme. And that then gives you the benefits of those greyed out options, as you're in control of your investment strategy, your funding strategy, and you can take any action you want to de-risk the scheme. So we've definitely been seeing more clients interested in that option to give themselves more options for their scheme. So yeah, these are the options, and then let's now turn to see what our clients have actually done in response to seeing the 2020 valuation results and the increasing contributions that revealed. As I said previously, many employers had already sort of exhausted that top row of options for future service, and around 60% of our clients were already close to future DB accrual at the last sort of valuation. However, for those that were still open to accrual at the 2020 valuation, their responses really fall into two groups. And you can see from the slide there that they've now either passed some or all of their increase in the future service rate contribution onto members, or they have decided to close the scheme to future DB accrual. And around 2/3 fall into the closing to future DB accrual, and then around 1/3 fall into the passing the contributions onto the members instead.
Is it worth just pausing there just to see if what actions, if any, anyone on the call has taken? Either do feel free to unmute yourself and let us know, or type something into the chat. But if you were providing defined benefits through SHPS up till recently, how have you dealt with that? It looks like we might have some. Tom looks like he might be typing. Thank you, Tom. So you're looking at sharing the contributions increase, which, you know, Charlotte said that's about 1/3 of our clients who still have defined benefit accrual are taking that approach. But given that the majority had already closed to future accrual, it's a relatively small group that are looking to continue providing defined benefit accrual, but sharing the cost increase. That certainly seems like that's obviously a very sensible step. Anybody else got any experience to share? Well, we can move on to talk about the other experience. Charlotte, I know you're about to cover some comments about the other options.
Thanks. Yeah, so we've also sort of seen some action from our clients looking at their past service benefits, and we've definitely seen some more activity from them looking to review past service benefits and sort of the pension strategy in general. And valuation results often sort of seem to prompt these reviews and these discussions. So it was a good reminder for everybody and kicks off people thinking about what action they might need to take for their pension scheme. So in particular, there has been more interest from our clients in looking to potentially transfer out of SHPS and run their own scheme. I think given the increase in deficit contributions coming through, employers are wanting to, if it's sort of affordable for them, they would rather know that their deficit contributions are going towards their members in their own segregated scheme, sort of transferred out of SHPS, rather than just paying those deficit contributions into sort of the general pot in SHPS. And as I highlighted earlier, previously, it gives employers also the options that are greyed out, so they can take control of the investment strategy and de-risking that they might want to take. And we also have a couple of clients thinking about paying their exit charge, and that would completely sort of extinguish their liability with SHPS. So there have been various actions we've seen our clients take following the valuation, with sort of all clients taking action against future service if they were still open to DB accrual. And it's prompted more of a review of past service benefits and looking at what could be done to make that more affordable and reduce risk. Did anyone have any further questions?
No, it doesn't look like we've got any questions at the moment. So that was the picture from the 2020 valuation. As Charlotte said, those contributions increasing this month following the valuation. And at that time, the deficit had gone up, the contributions were going up. But what have we seen since then? And we maintain a model where we're estimating how the SHPS funding position of the defined benefit section has changed. And that's what we're seeing on this chart here, starting on the left-hand side at just over £1.5 billion deficit. That was the figure that Charlotte mentioned at September 2020. Now, the light blue line shows how we would have expected the deficit to reduce gradually as associations pay more money towards the deficit in SHPS. And the dark blue line, that's slightly higher, is the position that we actually think has happened given the way that financial markets have changed. And the good news here is that pretty much since September 2020, our estimates show, and indeed figures from SHPS show, that the deficit has come down by more than we would have expected. And I think it is fair to say this is the first time that I've been able to say that. I think, I don't know how many similar sessions I've always had to comment that the SHPS funding position has worsened again. Well, actually, this time things have definitely improved. There is a step change in the middle of the slide where we have that pink circle. Charlotte mentioned that some employers have been transferring out from SHPS into their own scheme. So that involves taking a share of the liabilities of SHPS and a share of the assets of SHPS into an association's own scheme. A consequence of that is that that association also takes a share of the deficit with it. And so when we see transfers out coming through, the deficit reduces as a result of that. Our recent estimates on the right-hand side, around 450 million better than we would otherwise have expected. Would have expected the deficit to be about 1.2 billion at the moment. So down to something between 700 and 750 million. That's more than a 1/3 reduction in the deficit. And that change is really quite significant, and clearly that must be good news. So what does that mean for you as housing associations, and indeed for the trustees of SHPS? Well, we'll actually think about the SHPS trustees first, because as Charlotte said, they are the ones that have the power when it comes to SHPS to set the contributions and to decide how the money is invested. So what are some of the things that they could do? Well, if we're still ahead of the expectations when it comes to the next valuation, which is September 2023, well, one of the options that they would have is to reduce those deficit contributions that we saw in the chart before, the contributions that you're paying towards what was at September 2020 a £1.5 billion deficit. So that's one option. The other, another option, thinking that they have the power to set the investments of the scheme, and also thinking that SHPS is now largely closed to defined benefit accrual. So very few members earning further defined benefits in the scheme. So it's mostly a closed scheme. SHPS largely know the people that they are going to be providing pensions to through the DB section, and will have a very good idea of what those benefits are going to be. They therefore have a pretty sort of a very well-defined target for the amount of money that they need to pay out from the scheme over time. And if things have actually done well, if their investments have performed well in the recent past, then they need them to work less hard in the future to meet all those future payments. And that means that they're able to adopt a lower risk investment strategy. It might therefore deliver lower returns, but if you've already, if the investments have done well recently, then lower returns in the future wouldn't necessarily be a problem. So they have the scope to change the SHPS investments and move them to a lower risk position. So that's another option. And in practice, they could well do some combination of those two, reducing the contributions to some extent, but also reducing the risk in the investment strategy to some extent, because if they do reduce the investment strategy risk, that reduces the chance that they will need to come back to associations in the future and say, we need to ask for more money again. So I think that's something that I would certainly expect them to actively consider. And a less likely option on the right-hand side, could they even decide to call an actuarial valuation 1 year early and look at the numbers in September 2022? That could lead to lower contributions for associations earlier than if they stick with the 2023 valuation. I do think it's unlikely that they would do that, that there isn't any precedent for them doing so. But if it was the sort of thing that you or other associations felt was a good idea, then making representations to the SHPS employer committee would be one possibility. That employer committee is a group that represents you as employers in SHPS, and would be is involved in negotiations about future contributions with SHPS. So that would be a possibility, though I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope. It is also important to bear in mind that there is a new funding regime that I mentioned, the Pension Schemes Act earlier, as well as the new requirements around protecting benefits that people have earned. There is also some changes to the pensions funding regime, and that could prompt SHPS to take a more cautious approach in their funding. That would probably point more towards reduction in risk in the investment strategy rather than reduction in contributions. That's certainly an area that we'll have to see how that new funding regime actually plays out, because whilst the pensions regulator has consulted on some of their initial thinking, there's an awful lot more input that we need from them, and indeed from government, before we know what that regulation and that new regime is going to look like. So that's what the trustees will be thinking about. What does it mean for housing associations? Well, if we think about the reduced deficit contributions option, how could that come through? Well, with a significant reduction in deficit, we'd expect a significant reduction in the amount of contributions that you'd need to pay towards the rest of the deficit. And our estimates show that if we're in a similar position at September 2023 to where we are now, about 450 million ahead, then the annual deficit contributions, which will change in 3 years' time because the whole thing's on a 3-year cycle. So that's why we're saying from April 2025, we expect the reduction in deficit contributions to be more than 50% down. So that would be a significant change. An alternative is that rather than carrying on paying until 2028, the contributions stop at an earlier date. The amounts remain the same, but the recovery plan stops. Well, our estimates are that could finish by April 2026, so 2 years early. So that's two different options. If lower contributions is the way that SHPS decides to go. As I say, it could be some combination of this and changes to the investment policy. So this is just to give an idea of the possible order of magnitude. And what are some of the specific options that you could have? What are the things that I'd say that housing associations should be aware of at this point? Well, firstly, there is that possibility of reduction in contributions. Could that give you more capacity for bigger building programs? Could that give you more financial flexibility elsewhere in the organisation? Charlotte mentioned that exiting SHPS by paying the exit charge, the exit debt, that's something that for most organisations has just been way too much to even contemplate. But as Charlotte mentioned, we are now seeing some organisations think, well, actually, it's a lot of money, but it's a lot less than it used to be. So could that now be an affordable step that you might want to take? And if you were to look at that option of transferring out of SHPS, so having your own scheme and having access to those additional options of influencing the funding strategy, influencing how much you pay, that is, and influencing the investment strategy. If you were to do that now that things have improved, well, actually, it would give you the scope to reduce risk to a greater extent. Many of the employers that we've worked with that have taken this step have done so to gain greater control of the investment policy and the rate at which they pay contributions. And if the position looks healthier, it gives you more flexibility. So that's certainly something that I think employers who are thinking about transferring out of SHPS, that they will certainly have that in their minds. And there are steps that you can take to manage the liabilities, the defined benefit liabilities that you have within SHPS. If the exit charge was closer but still too much, there may be steps that you can take to remind your employees that they have the option of taking a transfer away from SHPS. And that certainly won't be right for everybody, but to the extent that there are some people where they decide that that is the right thing for them, having taken financial advice, that's something that could reduce your exit debt and indeed reduce the level of risk that you're facing as well, because those liabilities are then settled by a single payment and the uncertainty about how long that person might live in the future is removed. Our next slide just shows the associations which have taken that step of transferring away from SHPS. There have been 20 such transfers. We've advised on 8 of those in aggregate. And whilst 20, it doesn't sound like a large proportion of more than 400 employers in SHPS, I think one of the key statistics is in the circle on the left-hand side, showing that by liability, it's almost a quarter of SHPS now has transferred out. So it's very, very much true that it's larger organisations that take this step. But it's a trend that I think we expect to see continuing as employers see the risks of remaining within SHPS through the increase in contributions they're experiencing this month, and realise that, or certainly feel that they want to take some step to take more control of that. And if there are employers, once they have transferred out of SHPS, that they then have their own defined benefit schemes, or given the improvements in funding level, using the good news to essentially bank the investment profits and remove some of the risk. That's certainly a step that we'd be encouraging organisations in that position to take. So I think overall, if we just think about this SHPS section, it's certainly true employers have taken action to reduce their costs where possible in response to higher contributions. But since September 2020, which the current higher contributions are based on the position back that far, the position has definitely improved. And I think there are some opportunities for those employers in SHPS to at least look at the ways that the steps they can take to reduce risk, or to give themselves more influence over their risk in the future. Now, are there any questions on any of that? No, it doesn't look like it. Well, in that case, I'll hand over to Philip, who's going to talk about defined contributions, which of course are crucial in that all of you will be using defined contribution for at least some of your employees, and probably all of them.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Charlotte. Good afternoon, everyone. As Richard said, for every DB scheme, there has to be a DC section, particularly as many associations now offer DC as their kind of primary ongoing pensions vehicle, with, as we said earlier, over 60% having closed to DB accrual. The vehicle that most housing associations and many other employers, in fact, are now using, as you may well be aware, is a master trust. Now, in the context of SHPS, that's run by the Pensions Trust, TPT, and whether that's the SHPS DC section, or there is another subsection as well called the Flexible Retirement Plan, master trusts are pretty much now the DC delivery vehicle of choice for many scheme sponsors, not necessarily just housing associations, but in fact many other larger scheme sponsors and employers are now starting to use master trusts as their kind of primary DC vehicle. So for example, people like British Airways and Vodafone have relatively recently moved their future provision to a master trust. Why would they do that? Well, the potential attractions are obvious. It offers the opportunity for kind of outsourced governance. There's a central independent trustee board. It's also offers potential economies of scale. If your scheme is relatively small and you're joining a much bigger overall fund, the TPT DC section, I think the last time we looked at the valuation was something in a region of 4.5, possibly 5 billion. That gives you potentially more buying power as a relatively small organization, depending on your size, obviously. So essentially, you glue yourself to the hull of the master trust, and everything else is taken care of. Now, that's all very well, but it can lead in some cases, and we've seen this in work that we've done recently with clients, to almost a false sense of security. You know, I'm in the master trust, everything taken care of, thank you very much. But not all master trusts are equal, and in fact, the market is undergoing quite a significant sea change at this point in time. They first came to prominence when auto-enrollment started in earnest, and since then the market has grown quite considerably, partly as a result of legislative pressures, partly as a result of the pensions regulator pushing smaller own trust schemes in this particular direction. But when the market really got going, at one point there were 87 authorized master trusts, and when the regulator finally got round to looking at how these things were run a few years ago, and everything had to be reauthorized, that number went down quite drastically to 36. Now, we still think, on the strength of the research that we do, that is still too high. And in fact, in the next few years or so, that number of 36 or so will probably reduce to something closer to 15, possibly 20 in the years to come. Because if it's anything like the way in which the Australian market has developed, that had a similar profile relatively recently, and that's now down to what are called 9 supers. So we're reasonably confident that the UK market will actually go in this direction. So although you may be in a master trust, are you in a master trust that will actually be commercially active and capable of competing in this market going forward? And it's against this background that a lot of the research that we do in the DC team here at LCP has value. Now, we research the entire market, and I've got it in front of you rather than show you a blizzard of logos. These are the kind of typical providers that are kind of the major players in the market at this point in time. And they divide in particular into 3 distinct sections. Incidentally, if you see the word GPP in there, that's what's called a group personal pension plan. That's one of the alternative DC vehicles that some housing associations look at as potential alternatives going forward. But I think in the context of this afternoon's presentation, it's really the master trusts that we're going to concentrate on. You've got the traditional providers there. I'm sure you'll be familiar with a lot of the logos that are competing in the market. And sitting in the middle are what we call the kind of mass market providers. You'll see TPT and Nest and the People's Pension. Now, those are kind of sector-specific master trusts that really are designed to attract a particular type of client. The TPT scheme is operated on a not-for-profit basis and is really designed and accommodates quite a number of housing association schemes, whether that's in the DC section of SHPS or in fact the flexible retirement plan. But the newer kids on the block that have really come into the market are in fact the consultant badged propositions, such as Aon, Atlas, which was Capita, sitting underneath that, LifeSite and Mercer. The names are obvious there, and really those are kind of slightly more specialized vehicles going forward. But what we've seen going forward in particular is this kind of continued consolidation amongst master trust providers as the market develops as a whole. And I think that's why a number of our clients and the work that we've been doing in the DC section here is very important. And actually, when you start to look at what TPT can currently offer its clients compared to the alternative providers that are out there, it's actually quite interesting. I think when we've spoken to clients fairly recently, I think they felt that they basically have to stick with TPT. Now, there may be very good reasons for doing that in terms of members that have got both DC and DB benefits where there can be issues going forward. But increasingly, we're seeing a number of clients, particularly those that are paying the exit charge, taking this opportunity to have a look and basically see what else is available in the way of a kind of semi-audit of some kind to see whether better terms are available elsewhere, because the market has moved on quite considerably. Now, as I said, TPT is a not-for-profit organization. And so they're increasingly having to compete with the commercial master trusts, such as the Avivas and Standard Lifes and Legal and Generals of this world. And that's why actually the case study that we've got coming up, which I can just shift to that slide, will actually give you a kind of bit more of a background here. Now, this particular client was using SHPS DC. There was about 70 million. 300 members. Now that's a kind of fairly representative sample of a typical client size for TPT. because they were exiting ships, that meant that they couldn't use ships DC as their new alternative scheme going forward. So they had to find an alternative. Now, the potential immediate alternative for this client was to switch across over the garden fence, as it were, to the flexible retirement plan. But this particular client wanted to actually just test the waters and see what else is out there. Now, the background of some of this was also they were, it has to be said, not completely enamored with some of the functionality that was on offer from TPT. A lot of master trusts now offer online services and engagement opportunities in a way that members enjoy with their online bank accounts. And that's the way in which the master trust market is increasingly moved on. So we took this opportunity basically to kind of test the water. We completed a small scale provider selection exercise, went out to market, and the client was incredibly surprised by the response that they got. And that was that the alternative providers in the market, and two in particular, actually offered terms which were considerably lower than TPT currently offer. Now, they offer a standard fixed charge for most of their funds, but their core default fund in particular of 0.54%. And as you can see from the slide there, we managed to secure terms from an alternative provider which were considerably lower. Now, that is a good news issue as far as from an HR perspective. It doesn't mean that contributions necessarily have to change. It means that you can basically turn around and tell members that as a result of your efforts as the scheme sponsor, you've actually managed to make sure that the charges on your fund are considerably less, therefore there's more going into the pot and everything else that goes with it. Now, the other thing that became self-evident as a result of the analysis was that the range of online tools that alternative providers can now offer, as I've mentioned, we're currently considerably ahead of what TPT can currently offer. I think they've recognized that they're behind the curve as far as quite a lot of the functionality on the DC side is concerned. They are taking steps to address that, but I think in overall terms, they're probably 2 or 3 years behind the rest of the market in terms of the kind of member experience as a whole. So in this particular case, the client has actually taken the decision to move from TPT and introduce another provider. Typical timescales for those kind of projects last anything from 4 to 6 months. There are issues that you've got to keep an eye on here, such as members that have got both DB and DC benefits, to make sure that issues such as somebody's tax-free cash isn't compromised. But this is all kind of stuff that we're kind of quite familiar with and can be anticipated. And you've also got to bear in mind that a lot of the terms that a provider will offer will be contingent on them being able to hoover up the existing TPT funds under management. If it's just the regular contributions in isolation, you're leaving the existing funds behind, the terms that they will make available generally are not as competitive. Now that in turn means needing to liaise between the two master trusts to get the monies moved. It means issues such as consultation, but these are kind of well-trodden paths which are kind of very familiar now. And I think on balance, what we've starting to see is that a number of clients are actually starting to think that there are potentially alternative, potentially better deals out there. And it is certainly something that even if you decide not necessarily to move, that at least you then can demonstrate that you've taken the opportunity to test the water, to do an MOT, as it were, and reach some kind of decision in case you're asked. But as I say, it is interesting to see that the mandates that one would have assumed historically may not have necessarily been as attractive elsewhere in the commercial master trust market are actually now increasingly being looked at by the traditional providers, and TPT, it has to be said, is coming under some pressure as a result of that. So it's a very interesting way in which the market's developing as a whole, and it's largely because what we're seeing is master trusts are certainly remain the DC vehicle of choice. There are very few schemes that now operate on any other basis, and we expect master trusts to continue to dominate. Just because you're in a master trust, however, doesn't mean to say that your master trust will necessarily continue to be commercially competitive. It's a very, very competitive market out there at the moment. As we say, if you a small scale or whatever scale review does make sense from a governance perspective, so that you can at least show members or anyone else that's interested that you've taken a look at current pension provision, that you're thinking about potential member outcomes and the charges and everything else that goes with it, and that in fact, as we're seeing, there are potentially some significantly better deals out there than some of the fixed fees that that TPT currently offer. So that's my quick take on what the market's been doing as a whole. Unless anyone's got any queries, I'll hand back to Richard.
Thanks, Philip. Any questions? Not mine. Thank you. So this is just to wrap up then. We talked about, or our aim for the day was to cover SHPS defined benefit and also talk about defined contribution developments. We've seen that there's an improvement in the funding level in SHPS DB, which is great news, and that definitely gives associations some options to consider. Philip's talked about the latest in the defined contribution market and the fact that we're working with the housing associations that are actually looking at achieving better value for their members in defined contribution schemes by changing provider. And that's essentially a new development, one that we wouldn't necessarily have expected to see a year or two ago. And just to come back to the point I mentioned at the start, the new Pension Schemes Act requirements, those are certainly very relevant for any organisation that's looking considering corporate activity, and we're now seeing housing associations very much factor that into their thinking when it comes to mergers, refinancing, and routine governance as well. So 3 areas to think about there. We'd be very happy to take any other questions. And in the absence of questions, we'll just mention that we will be running more sessions. Julia and colleagues will, I'm sure, be in touch soon about subsequent sessions. There is a link that will be on the slides that perhaps Winmark, will you be circulating the slides? Yeah. Yeah. A link there to sign up to our to receive bulletins and information from us on all things pensions. And for those of you particularly interested in defined contribution pensions, our annual defined contribution and financial wellbeing conference is just in a couple of weeks' time. Be very pleased if anybody would like to join that to hear more about the work of our defined contribution team, and indeed looking more broadly at financial wellbeing as well. And to find out more about that, do go to the LCP website, and there's an events page where you can sign up. If anybody is interested, just as we mentioned at the bottom of that previous slide, sorry, I should have remembered that. If any of you feel that your boards could benefit from some greater understanding about SHPS and the options within SHPS, then we'd be very happy to run through that with them at a high level on a complimentary basis. Do get in touch with us if that's something you'd like to pursue.